We left off in this class talking about the racial relations between whites and African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. And when we did so, we did in a manner that showcased the significance of the failure of Reconstruction. And we talked about, as Reconstruction fell to the wayside, these Jim Crow laws flourished in the South, and we talked about things like the poll taxes. We talked about separate but equal that came out of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in the late 19th century. So throughout most of the first 3 to 4 decades of the 20th century, African Americans would continue to fight to push these Jim Crow laws aside. One of the biggest organizations, of course, was one that sprung out of the Niagara Declaration that we talked about earlier in the semester in W.E.B. Du Bois. That is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Well, what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up this story in the 1940s and carry it through the 1960s in talking about this civil rights movement to end Jim Crow in America and make this nation truly equal. And this period in the 1940s and particularly the 1960s is known among historians as the Second Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction failed to bring about a more racial equitable society. Here we're going to see that somewhat change, particularly again in the 1960s. We're actually going to start the story a little earlier than most professors probably, who started in the 1950s. And we're actually going to start here in the 1940s. And the reason why is because we see a new organization that springs up, and that is the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. This group, formed in 1942, was a combination, an interracial movement, if you will, of white and black students. And it was started by James Farmer, an African American, and another guy by the name of George Hauser. And when they formed this Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, in 1942, they were also members, along with other of this original group, of a group known as the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I bring this up because the Fellowship of Reconciliation was a pacifist organization that used nonviolent civil disobedience as its primary tactic. So this is key here, this idea of nonviolent civil disobedience, because as this moves from the pacifist movement into the civil rights movement, it will really be for the next 20 years the main tactic relied upon by these civil rights activists, where they're basically going to carry out these various actions. For instance, CORE itself in 1943 in Chicago would carry out sit-ins at a restaurant to force this restaurant to desegregate its lunch counter. So what did this sit-in involve? Well, it was a form of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, and it essentially meant you go to these areas, sit yourself down in a whites-only section, as they were known as during this time, and refused to move after the owner of this establishment refused to serve you and was threatening to call the police. And once the police were called, you as a civil rights protester, relying on this nonviolent civil disobedience, would therefore just lay dead and force the police officer to inflict pain on you, oftentimes, whether it be just simply dragging you out or using a nightstick or other forms of violence. So this is key strategy, like I said, for essentially the next 20 odd years in the civil rights movement. Well, faced with this growing chorus of demands by civil rights activists associated with CORE, associated with the NAACP, and other groups, President Harry Truman began to voice his support for a presidential commission to investigate civil rights. And this was in late 1946, where he signed the legislation, or he signed the executive order, to bring about this commission. Well, this commission completed its report in 1947, and it was known as To Secure These Rights. Now, you're reading this document for today's class, but nonetheless, I do want to talk about some things, some issues in this report that extend beyond the portion that you're reading for this class. First of all, the report, and this is the key part here, the report called for strong federal action against several areas. For instance, lynching, It would speak out against lynching that was being carried out throughout primarily the South, but also certain areas in the North, voter suppression, job discrimination, and segregation in the armed forces. So in short, this document to secure these rights is significant because really for the first time since Reconstruction, we see the federal government inching towards saying that the federal government must indeed step in to secure these rights for African Americans. Well, in the end, despite this vast concern for the plight of African Americans, the federal government would really do only one thing, and even that was not through legislation, but rather it was through an executive order, and that would be in July of 1948, where Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which banned discrimination in the military. Now that we have this brief background behind us, I want to talk about the birth of the so-called modern civil rights movement. And if you want to look to one event that really encapsulated this new fervent desire for freedom in the 1950s, it was, of course, the Montgomery Bus Boycott that took place in late 1955 and into 1956. Now, this story, as a lot of you have probably heard in past classes, involved Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress who had a long history of involvement with civil rights activism and had more recently been an important member of the local NAACP. Now, I want to highlight what I just said there because the story that's normally told is that this woman, Rosa Parks, was simply a tired African-American woman, 42 years old, didn't want to stand on her feet. There was no room in the back of the bus where blacks were restricted to, so therefore she took a seat in the whites-only section up front. But clearly this very brief history that I gave of her being involved in civil rights activism in the past and actually being a member of the local NAACP sort of pushes aside that fact that she was really a major part of the civil rights movement in the South, and she was a clear actor in this movement. But nonetheless, when she took a seat in the front of the bus in 1955, December 1st of 1955, she was doing so specifically because she wanted to test Alabama state law that segregated city buses. So this is really an effort, like I said, to give her some agency. She was not doing this simply because she was tired after a long day of work, but rather because she, again, wanted to test this state law that prohibited segregation in transportation in Alabama. Well, following her arrest, a boycott ensued, and this boycott will bring about the introduction of a 26-year-old minister from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And this minister, not surprisingly, was Martin Luther King Jr. Well, with African Americans making up over 75% of the city's bus riders, the boycott had its intended effect. So what you're going to see during this time, like we see on the image here to the right, is a lot of African Americans will rely on carpooling. They will simply look for there's few African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama that have a car, and they will cram into these cars, so therefore they did not have to ride on the buses. Other times they would simply walk. Sometimes they would even hitchhike here when it was necessary. But nonetheless, here we have now Montgomery, Alabama, facing a shortage of 75% of its bus riders because these African Americans are carrying out these boycotts. And what you're going to see is a lot of anger, particularly among downtown businesses, because these downtown business owners are recognizing that when these buses used to go through the downtown business district, a lot of African Americans used to get off and shop in their businesses. That was no longer happening, so now there are substantial losses because these African Americans were no longer purchasing goods. Well, despite this, the boycott would last for more than 1 year until by the time we get into late 1956, the Supreme Court would rule the city's segregated buses as unconstitutional. By the time the Montgomery bus boycott started in late 1955, the Supreme Court had also stepped up to fight for the rights of African Americans and particularly African American children, to receive an equal education. So this is where we get to the events of 1954 in the Supreme Court case known as Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board combined five cases from states in the South, meaning South Carolina and Virginia, the Northeast, Delaware and Washington, D.C., and the Midwest, Kansas. By doing this, by choosing these five cases from states all across the country in the Northeast, in the Midwest, which are supposed to be more acceptive of African Americans, as well as the Southern cases, the NAACP sought to illustrate that school segregation existed in all regions of the country, not just the South. So this was clearly a dig at these Northerners who were claiming that they're superior to their fellow citizens in the South because they claimed the North did not segregate. Well, Brown v. Board, in fact, proved that there was a lot of segregation in the North. Interestingly, though, the South Carolina case, and the South Carolina case was known as Briggs v. Elliott. Briggs v. Elliott. In this Supreme Court case that preceded Brown v. Board actually came about due to the vast difference between tax dollars spent on white children and black children. So for instance, in South Carolina, $179 was spent on every white pupil. Compare that to the $43 that was spent on every African American child in South Carolina. But here's the interesting thing. Even though the NAACP was thinking that Brown v. Board would deal with this issue of discrepancy in spending per pupil based on their color, this is not what the Supreme Court did. Rather, the Supreme Court, under the direction of Chief Justice Earl Warren, a Republican, did not focus on these economic differences, but rather something different. The court relied heavily on research conducted by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Now, these two social scientists had conducted doll experiments in the past, and what these doll experiments involved was the following. They said, when given the choice between a white doll and a black doll, young black girls would select the white doll. So clearly, and this is the image that we see on the right of this test being carried out by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, this is what led the Warren Court, the Supreme Court in 1954, to rule the decision in Brown v. Board. So what I want to do here, I'll mention in a little while here, this idea of Brown 2 in 1955. But before we get back to that, I want to talk briefly about the outcome and the argument made by the Supreme Court regarding this separate education, separate but equal, that stems from Plessy v. Ferguson back in the late 19th century. So here we see on the screen some of the quotes that I picked out of the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision of 1954. And I want you to link these to what I was just talking about with the Kenneth and Mamie Clark experiment, the doll experiment in the previous slide. So this first quote, "To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and mind in a way unlikely ever to be done." So this is clearly connected to what Kenneth and Mamie Clark were saying in their doll experiment, that because all of the black children were choosing white dolls, that this early racism that these children experienced, it had long-lasting effects. You can see that in the last portion of this quote, may affect their hearts and mind in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So this relates to the next quote. "A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system." So in short, what that quote is saying is again, going back to the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll experiment, we have here African American children feeling a sense of inferiority, an inferiority complex that extends well past their childhood into adulthood, and therefore they will basically be unable to obtain the same educational advances and mental development as white children. So therefore, and here's the most important thing, because this is the final piece of the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So what we have here with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 is Plessy v. Ferguson is now overturned. But I want to be clear about this. In 1954, Plessy v. Ferguson is only overturned in terms of education. Separate but equal doctrine no longer applies to education because of this Brown v. Board of Education ruling here in 1954. But now I want to go back to that Brown 2 decision that took place in 1955. Because what Earl Warren did was, in order to achieve a unanimous decision on the Supreme Court to prove that the Supreme Court was fully behind desegregation of America's public schools, Warren did not include in the decision instructions for schools about carrying out desegregation. So not surprisingly, because there was no specific date, schools, particularly in the South, soft-pedaled. They didn't push for desegregation in their schools. Therefore, in 1955, the Supreme Court issued its so-called Brown 2 decision. And even this is a little murky, because what the Supreme Court did was it told school districts to desegregate their schools, quote, with all deliberate speed. So here we see, again, even with Brown 2, a reluctance by the Supreme Court to tell school districts you have to do this by a certain date. Well, in addition to the vague language used by the court in regard to how states should implement the decision, Southerners sought to obstruct the decision, as illustrated by the Southern Manifesto that you are reading for this week's class. This Southern obstruction of the Brown v. Board decision in 1954 was known as massive resistance. And here's the thing that made massive resistance possible, and that was President Eisenhower's reluctance to push desegregation on Southern society. In fact, President Eisenhower in the 1950s was no friend of the civil rights movement. In fact, just to give you an idea of how racist he was during this time, he had a meeting with Chief Justice Earl Warren. And during that meeting, the president had reportedly said of Southern opponents of desegregation what you see on the screen. These are not bad people. All they're concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit alongside some big overgrown Negroes. This is the President of the United States that is basically saying, in private, nonetheless, but still saying that he supports these Southern efforts to push back against desegregation. So therefore, because the Southern states begin to see a reluctance within the federal government to push Brown v. Board stronger, the implementation of Brown v. Board stronger, we start to see schools stand out and say, we are not going to desegregate. And one of the most prominent examples of this resistance took place in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Little Rock Central High School at the start of the 1957-1958 school year. That year, Little Rock Central High School admitted 9 African American students. Well, in response, the state's governor, a guy by the name of Orville Faubus, called the Arkansas National Guard to block their entrance into the school. Moreover, when the black students attempted to enter the school, whites taunted and abused them. And it wasn't even primarily other white students that were doing this abuse, but rather, as we can see on this image to the right, these are grown white adults who are just inflicting verbal assaults in addition to throwing rocks and other small items at these African American students. The most emblematic hatred and vitriol is in that woman in the center of this image. You can see the face that she is making, just a pure hatred of this young African American woman doing what she is now, because of Brown v. Board, constitutionally entitled to do, and that is enter a so-called white school. Well, Governor Orville Faubus would eventually remove the National Guard. which would, yeah, allow these African American students to enter the school, but at the same time actually made matters worse because now it allowed this white angry mob to do as they pleased and circle the school when the black students finally made their way up to the doors. Well, Eisenhower sees what's going on and he is dismayed. It's one thing to use less kind of visual and more hidden ways to keep African Americans out of schools, but to put on this show as was carrying out in Little Rock Central High School was too much for Eisenhower even, and he will eventually and reluctantly nationalize the Arkansas National Guard to ensure that these African American students, these 9 African American students, are allowed entrance to that school. But I want to be clear about this. When you're reading the document, the speech by Eisenhower that nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard, was Eisenhower, even in this speech, really supporting civil rights, or were his actions based on something else? By the early 1960s, things started to become more intense and violence started to increase and attention began to grow in terms of the public's realization that perhaps something needed to be done. And one of the key events during this period was something that took place in May of 1963 involving Martin Luther King and his organization known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the police chief of Birmingham, Alabama, a guy by the name of Bull Connor. So I want to start here in May of 1963 with the organization of the Birmingham Campaign. Birmingham, Alabama was the most segregated city in the country. City officials had gone so far as to close public parks when the federal courts ordered them to be integrated. Whites also relied on violence to terrify local African Americans, which led to the city being known nationally among civil rights activists as Birmingham, Alabama. Well, thus, hoping to force Congress and President John F. Kennedy to introduce and pass new civil rights legislation, Martin Luther King organized Project C, with the C standing for confrontation. And what this Project C intended to do was to show Americans the brutal tactics used by that local police chief that I referred to earlier, Bull Connor. And Martin Luther King was very smart here in understanding that it wasn't just about the confrontation, but the fact that this confrontation would be televised and spread across not only the entire nation, but across the entire world. And what you have probably noticed as you're looking at the documents, or you will notice when you look at the documents for this class, a lot of the discussion about civil rights, particularly among U.S. officials, was the fear that these poor relations between whites and blacks in the United States would have important ramifications in America's battle against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But nonetheless, before the protest actually started itself, King would turn himself into the police for violating a local order against staging a protest. Well, while in jail here, he would compose his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Now, I want you to use this document, which you're also reading for this class, to help you understand what Martin Luther King's vision of civil rights was, particularly his views on integrationism, his views on nonviolent civil disobedience, and his feelings of black power, these more militant African American civil rights activists. So nonetheless, he writes this letter from Birmingham jail. It gets his philosophy out there. Once released, he would put his plan in action. And this plan started on May 3rd of 1963, when hundreds of activists, especially children were purposely chosen to show the brutality of Connor's police regime, but nonetheless, these hundreds of activists, along with children, would begin to protest. The children were hit with fire hoses and attacked by police dogs, as we can see on the image here on the right. Now, some of these fire hoses were so powerful that they would actually take the bark off of trees in the park where portions of this protest was taking place. So you can see the violence being carried out by Bull Connor's police force. Now, President Kennedy, supposedly said the photographs of these abuses made him sick. Kennedy attempted, because he was so dismayed by what was going on, Kennedy attempted to broker an agreement to end the violence, but this failed. Finally, on May 13th, federal troops were sent to Birmingham and the confrontation ended, but only after much violence, including firebombing of Martin Luther King's local residence and rioting by African Americans in response to this. So about a month later, on June 11th, 1963, John F. Kennedy gave a nationally televised speech to the nation announcing his intention to introduce civil rights legislation. He did so, but he did nothing to get the bill passed, so it remained stuck in Congress until after his assassination in November of 1963, when Lyndon Johnson, a surprising civil rights advocate from the South, from the state of Texas, would take this issue of civil rights and expand it to a greater level than ever before since Reconstruction. So as we talked about previously, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represented the biggest change in terms of the role of government in U.S. society since the New Deal. Well, we're going to see a similar dynamic on the civil rights revolution that takes place as part of the Great Society, because this will be the most momentous moment for African Americans since the first Reconstruction after the Civil War. And we're going to start here with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson, the former head of the Senate Majority Leader, was able to convince his former colleagues, including Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen from Illinois, and a group of Republicans to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And this was important because by bringing these Republicans on board to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Johnson was successfully able to overcome the opposition of Southern Democrats to pass this piece of legislation. So what did the 1964 Civil Rights Act do? The legislation forbade discrimination in public accommodations. So that means it was no longer acceptable to have a whites-only bathroom. It was no longer acceptable to have a whites-only drinking fountain, or a lunch counter, or a hotel, so on and so forth. Basically anything that existed in public, even private businesses that provided public services like food, housing, so on and so forth, now had to be desegregated. So this is the key here. This 1964 Civil Rights Act would now completely overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate but equal was now, leave no doubt about it, illegal. According to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in combination with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education, separate but equal was no longer allowed in any area throughout the United States. But I want to pick up one other thing about the 1964 Civil Rights Act that would have an unintended effect on another group of people in the United States, and that is women. Because what a lot of Southern senators did was they decided they were going to include in the legislation something known as Title VII. Title VII forbade job discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. Well, what these Southern legislators did was they added to that list of race, color, religion, or national origin, sex. So in short, what they did was they put sex into the bill, hoping to discourage their male colleagues from voting in favor of the bill. But this backfired, because what would happen now is women would now be able to refer to Title VII to demand that they be allowed access to employment, equal employment with whites and white males. This would be a huge win for the women, as we'll talk about in the second wave feminism after this lecture. But nonetheless, with discrimination in public places banned, civil rights activists would now turn to voting rights. And this was a huge deal for African Americans. If you remember the 15th Amendment, going all the way back to Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment supposedly provided African Americans with the right to vote. But then we talked about the various forms of roadblocks and impediments put in their way with these Jim Crow laws in the South. And as a result, by 1965, only 32% of voters were registered to vote in Louisiana, 19% were registered to vote in Alabama, and look at this, Mississippi, only 6% of all African American voters eligible to vote were actually registered to vote. So therefore, after a lot of deadly encounters, one of the most prominent was across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where civil rights activists were bloodied in front of cameras fighting for the right to vote. Lyndon Johnson, in August of 1965, would finally sign the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act prohibited voting discriminations in election and thereby outlawed things like the literacy test and the poll tax and those other examples that I gave earlier in the semester. But in addition to outlawing these acts, it also required states that did not allow a certain percentage of African Americans to register to vote to accept federal examiners into their state to register these African Americans. So in short, what we're seeing here is the federal government is prying open the doors of these states, pushing aside the states' rights argument and going into these southern states to register African Americans themselves if the states will not allow these African Americans to register to vote. What I want to do for the remainder of this lecture is I want to talk about something that historians have been discussing really since the civil rights movement existed in the 1960s, and that is a growing divide that begins to take place around 1965, 1966 between people like Martin Luther King, who are more acceptive of this gradualism, and more radical elements who say that nonviolent civil disobedience, working with white politicians in Washington, is not doing enough. It's not moving civil rights ahead fast enough. So therefore, these Black Power advocates, as they are known as, are demanding more speed and, if necessary, the use of violence to obtain these civil rights. But I want to be clear from the start, there were always critics of the gradualism of Martin Luther King. And one of them, most prominently, was a guy by the name of Malcolm X, who was a member of the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam was a black separatist organization that was highly critical of King's political involvement and his integrationist efforts. So for instance, Malcolm X would describe Martin Luther King as a chump, not a champ. Any man who puts his women and children on the front line is a chump, not a champ, in regard to the Birmingham Campaign of May of 1963. In short, what Malcolm X and some of the late Black Power advocates that we're talking about in this lecture demand is this idea, and this is very important, self-defense. They're saying, if you are an African American, don't just sit back and allow these white police officers and white Southerners to beat you to a pulp, but rather arm yourself so that you can protect yourself and meet violence with violence. Malcolm X was early on in the 1960s a big proponent of self-defense. Well, in addition to Malcolm X, you would also have another group form in April of 1960 known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this group was formed in the aftermath of a lunch counter sit-in that started in Greensboro, North Carolina in February of 1960 to desegregate restaurants. Now, their work to register voters in the South put them in great danger, which made them more willing to confront racism head-on with this idea of self-defense. And I want to point to one event in particular. It's usually seen as the apex, the mountaintop of the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, and that is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August of 1963. So this was held, of course, as you can see on the image on the right, in the shadow of the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, and it was attended by 250,000 people. You can see that on the image to the right, whites and blacks of this 250,000 people. Now, Martin Luther King and the other organizers of this March on Washington wanted to keep the movement joyous and happy because they were fearful that if they showed too much anger, the civil rights legislation in Congress here in August of 1963 would not pass. So therefore, we see a controversy come up. And this controversy is started because the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a guy by the name of John Lewis, goes to give a speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And this speech was essentially an effort to show the problems of working with white politicians. So for instance, one of the things this speech was going to say is a quote that we see on the screen. American politics is dominated by politicians who build their career on immoral compromising. He would also, with John Lewis, plan to speak on this, give this speech and include talk of revolution. Well, when Martin Luther King and some of the other organizers of this march got wind of this speech, they said, no way, we're not going to let John Lewis give this very hardcore speech. So early on, again, even at the pinnacle of this sort of Martin Luther King-esque civil rights movement, we see some disagreement that will only rise when people like Stokely Carmichael, as we'll talk about in a second, enter the stage. So what I want to talk about now is that individual that I talked about just a second ago, Stokely Carmichael, and his role in the rise of Black Power. And to begin this story, I want to go down to Alabama again, particularly Lowndes County, Alabama, which was given the name Bloody Lowndes because of the white violence against civil rights activists in that Alabama county. Well, Stokely Carmichael, the man on the left, became a project director for SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's voter registration drives in 1964. As a leader of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the LCFO, Carmichael not only fought to register African Americans to vote, but also have the organization serve as an independent, black-led political party, which he believed would allow for self-determination for African Americans. This is key, this idea of self-determination for African Americans and what it meant for Stokely Carmichael. But as all this is going on, we really won't see Black Power become prominent until the couple years later, after 1964, in 1966, with something that was sort of unexpected and relatively unknown until Stokely Carmichael, Martin Luther King, and others got involved. And this was an effort by James Meredith. James Meredith in 1961 had become the first African American student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. And moving ahead up here to 1966, James Meredith had planned a 220-mile trek all the way from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi in support of civil rights. Well, as it turned out, on the second day of his march, he was shot by a sniper, and across the nation you would have images of this bloodied body of James Meredith crawling across the road after he was shot. Now, Meredith would survive, and he'd actually join the march later on, but in the meantime, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and others continued the walk for Meredith. Well, as the march continued, the marchers arrived at Greenwood, Mississippi. Carmichael, immediately upon his arrival in Greenwood, Mississippi, would be arrested for, of all things, trespassing. Now, he had been arrested some 26 times before this, so this was nothing new. But nonetheless, upon his release, he would give a speech. And I have a portion of it up on the screen here. I'm going to read it. He said during the speech the following: "This is the 27th time that I've been arrested. I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we gonna stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. What we're gonna start saying now is Black Power." Soon after this portion of the speech was given, you would see in the crowd begin to shout Black Power, Black Power, and now African American civil rights activists who are angry at the slow gradualism of Martin Luther King have a new slogan to fight for. Well, the white public and the white journalists reacted sort of in a way that was expected among African Americans. So for instance, Time magazine would describe Black Power as a racist philosophy. the Saturday Evening Post would predict a white backlash in response to Black Power. What I want you to do when you're reading the document on Black Power from Stokely Carmichael is answer that question. Was Black Power a racist philosophy, and was Black Power a violent philosophy? Because what's going to happen, particularly beginning in 1967, where you have these huge racial riots in places like Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, you're going to have a lot of whites saying that Black Power is all about violence. Well, is that true if we actually look at the documents that we have for this week?